speaking of human and social capital, we have all these smart people floating around, some of whom are even friends of mine. So I invited a close friend of mine, Professor Ezra Sivan, to come and teach with me today on a subject very close to his heart, which is the Jewish calendar, because if you were paying attention in chapter 12, God talks about the calendar. So Ezra, come on up. And part of the wonderful thing about having all this power as the rabbi, I get to invite whoever I want. So
it's just going to be the peanut gallery.
No. You got to sit up here. Tony, do you want to? So they did two, I think.
Those two pieces.
Well, this has the.
Okay.
Okay. So. Yeah. So, and this one has the, which we didn't do. So you can pass that out too, but that's not stapled, so I apologize for that. So the Ezra, we have Xeroxed for you two different things, one of which is a brief passage. Scholars use the term brief euphemistically, obviously, from the late Nahum Sarna, very distinguished professor of the Hebrew Bible at Brandeis, taught at Brandeis for many years, and maybe better known around here as Jonathan Sarna's father. But Professor Sarna wrote two important books that really try to bridge the worlds of scholarship on the Hebrew Bible with people like us, readers, popular readers of the Bible. He also did the 2 volumes of the Jewish Publication Society Torah commentary, but he wrote Understanding Genesis and Exploring Exodus, which are two terrific books. And Ezra kindly reproduced for us, with Tony and Lorraine's help, the section on Exodus 12, which we're going to talk through in a second, dealing with this whole notion of the institution of the Israelite calendar. So you should be getting two different sets of Xeroxes, one of which is a very nice, easy to read piece from Professor Sarna, and then the other, which is a little less easy to read, but the back has the verse, what is it, Kings? Malachim?
Yep, 1 Kings.
Book of Kings 1, chapter 6, which is a kind of an appendage to the Exodus section. So Ezra, you want to take over?
Oh, am I just doing this? Okay.
You can introduce it, and then we'll.
Sure.
And Professor Sivan is a professor of economic sociology at MIT at the Sloan School. But before he became an economic sociologist, he got a very wonderful Hebrew day school education in Providence, where his late father, was a professor of political science. So he's been thinking about these things for a very long time, and he's now writing a book on the Hebrew calendar generally, but specifically on the institution of Shabbat. So he's got a lot to say about that, which he's not all going to say today, but anyway.
Definitely not. So I usually get to be in the peanut gallery. So part of the reason I was excited about the invitation is that from the glimpses I've gotten of this community, I've very much enjoyed with the interaction when David puts something in front of you and then how you react to it. So I'll try to limit what I say. I'm curious how people react. I'll say a couple of things. One is, so there's a misnomer in what David said. That is a very common misnomer, and I think is useful to have in mind, which is David said, so the chapter 12 of Exodus,
which is found, just if you want to toggle back in the Chumash, it's found on page 380, chapter 12, verse 1. Sorry, Ezra, go ahead.
Yeah. So you're interrupting me when I was about to correct you on something. So here we go. So, and this is something that took a long time in the project that I'm working on to really sort out for myself. So I think it's not very clear, and it's definitely not clear among most historians who work on this kind of things. That is, the word calendar is a very, very tricky word. Now, what is a calendar? I think that's maybe the most important question that can come out of just reading chapter 12 of Exodus and putting it in context and thinking about it. So the word calendar is a word that comes from, it's a Latin word that comes from calends, right, which is part of the old Roman calendar, which was a lunar calendar, lunar solar, similar to the Mesopotamian calendar, which is really where the Israelite calendar comes from. And one way to think about what's happening in chapter 12 is it's an announcement of we're going back on a Mesopotamian, really kind of a kind of calendar that was broadly used in the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean too, in the ancient civilized world, but that was not used. That's what Starr is emphasizing in Egypt. Egypt was unusual in being very, very focused on the sun, and that made sense in the Egyptian context because it had to do with the importance of the Nile and the cresting of the Nile in the spring. It was all basically you couldn't live right in Egypt unless it was something that was driven by the seasons. And was the somewhere out in, I guess, further south in Africa, you needed the seasons to work and for the snow melt to come down and then the Nile to have enough water to crest, and that made what otherwise was parched land turn green. Right? But the word calends was it comes from Latin, and I think it notes a couple different things that are important. One is it came out of a lunar solar calendar, which meant you were on a lunar cycle, 29 and a half day lunar cycle that then you would adjust with some regularity, but to make it a lunar solar calendar. And that's part of what Starr is talking about here happens in the Israelite calendar is it's going to be every Aviv, every spring is going to be this festival, which is going to be which is going to mark a year. Right, so Chodesh Hazeh Lachem Rosh Chodashim Rishanhu Lachem L'Chodshei Hashana. This new crescent moon marks a new month, but it also marks a new year somehow. But year is a purely solar concept, right? So that's what that marks. It marks the lunar solar kind of combination. It means socially, politically, religiously, we're going to have some kind of renewal every spring, and that's really important. But the reason I say, okay, so why is it a misnomer? I didn't say that part, right? So we live in a world. So I think when most people even of the internet age or the smartphone age, but certainly if you grew up and I did, I was born in 1970. And if you asked me to picture a calendar, I would picture a wall calendar, right? Of something like there's a month, and then there's it's got 7 columns in it for the days of the week, right? And then you start the month on the day that happens to be the first day of the month, which usually is not a Sunday, right? Or a Monday if you're in Europe. Sometimes they start on Monday rather than Sunday, which is an interesting issue. But basically, it kind of snakes across the 30 or 28 or 29 or 30, 31 days of the Gregorian month. And that's what we picture as the calendar, right? And then the week is embedded in that as part of the same kind of way of organizing our day-to-day life. If you were to picture the first, so then if by contrast, you picture the very first time in history where you might see the 7-day week and what you might call a calendar, and that is in Pompeii. So in Pompeii, there's a couple of places. So this is frozen in time from the year 79 of the Common Era. It's after the introduction of the Julian calendar, which is really almost the same as our calendar, a slight variation that comes from Pope Gregory in the 16th century and later. But it's a fixed solar calendar. That's what the Julian calendar is, right? It's actually based on the old Egyptian calendar. And it was a revolution in that Julius Caesar, in taking over making the Roman Empire, and then his nephew Octavian kind of solidified. It was a radical departure from the old Roman calendar, in that it was solar and fixed, which meant that they had a leap day. The leap day seems like a trivial thing to us. It was revolutionary because it made a fixed calendar so that it was fixed exactly in sync, or almost exactly in sync, with the solar cycle, whereas the Egyptian calendar would actually be a little off by what is that, a quarter of a day every year. And so that it's over the thousands of years, it would actually cycle around so it was solar, but not really fixed with the solar year, solar based. The point I want to make is, if you looked in Pompeii, what you would see is something that looks like a Julian month, which is a Gregorian month, 30 or 31 days, and next to it were the days of the planetary week, one of the first instances of seeing the week, which they got from us, by the way, but that's for another time. But the point is, they wouldn't integrate them. They were completely different systems. The week was used basically for routines, like we use for it today, for returning to Shabbat, or it could be a market day or something like that eventually. You would return to it, and it would be kind of the same day, right? Which is the way we experience the week. Whereas calendars were used for contracts, were used for public festivals, were used for long-term planning. And they were completely different systems. Eventually, they merged in our experience, in the Western experience, and then in the world experience. But they were completely different systems. And the Torah presents them as completely different systems, though they're related in some way. So that's in next week's portion, the Torah will introduce the cycle of the week, and it does it completely separately from this, which reflects, again, an ancient sensibility. These are different kinds of systems. One of them used in the first instance here for a public festival, which is Passover, what we call Passover, and the festival of Matzot, which are integrated in our experience as one holiday, but seem to be sort of two related holidays here, right? But they're sort of a festival that's on a lunisolar calendar. That's what's being announced. And completely separately from this, you get the 7-day week as a recurring schedule with this kind of peak day, which is a Sabbath. That's introduced in chapter 16, not chapter 12. So they're separate. They're different systems. So they're in dialogue with each other, which is interesting. Anyway, so I throw that out there as sort of like, what is a calendar, right? And then what Sarna is saying is, this is a calendar that's revolutionary, I think, in two ways. One is it's sort of an emancipation declaration that really only makes sense in the context of the Egyptian experience. That we're saying, enough with Egypt and its culture and its suppression of the moon. The moon is important. It's important in the ancient world, and this is how we kind of maybe mark the days, our days, what's important to us in our lives. And don't suppress the moon. The moon and the sun kind of go together in some way, and we're going to organize our lives in that way. And then there's a second thing, I think, which is marked on that 80.
The last page,
the last
page 85.
I put a little orange there. And that, I think, is really, really important, and also is a little hard for us to tell because we're so used to it, right? So another thing that was an ancient innovation that got integrated into our system, and that I think today we take for granted, I certainly took for granted before I started doing this research, is something that's very subtle, which is the counting of years from a fixed point in time, right? So just a few weeks ago, happy 2024 to everybody. I used to think New Year's celebrations were very trivial, unimportant things, especially since, we've got our Rosh Hashanah, and that's where my real, I've come to really appreciate New Year's. And that is because at the very least, there's two aspects of a New Year's celebration, New Year's celebration as we celebrate them, that would have been unimaginable to the ancients and are, I think, actually an important political achievement. And that is, number one, that the calendar is fixed. So just like that, it goes back to Julius Caesar in the Roman Empire. Ironically, they, in making a fixed calendar so that no kings could intervene in it, they got kings and political authorities out of the calendar business. Because part of, I think, what's implicit what Sarna is saying, and in the critique of the Egyptian calendar that comes across in chapter 12-13, is that in the old days, calendars were basically the schedules for political authorities, which also meant that sometimes political authorities in those days would have our welfare in mind, but oftentimes they were symbols of tyranny, right? And so basically kings would make schedules for themselves, kings and priests, maybe magistrates of some kind, political authorities, for their own purposes. But today, because the calendar is fixed, there's one thing that they can't monkey with. It's actually our official calendar. And we get to count year by year by year. It's our count. Ironically, little is in our case, because it sort of seems to recognize, the founder of a successor religion or would-be successor religion to ours, but it doesn't really, right? It's kind of a civil calendar. And the very notion of having a continuous count is actually a thumb in the eye of kings, because the way it worked, and you can see it in chapter 6 of Kings, in that quote, is the way it used to work in the old days was there would be a count, that would renew every time there was a new king. And king gets sort of like almost, when there was a new king, there would be like new time. Right? But now it doesn't matter what the political transition is, we continue to count. The count is sort of like more important than the king. And that's what Starr is emphasizing, something really important, which is this is the first time in history, actually. He wrote this now, I think, in the 80s, right?
Yeah.
And that so far seems to be true, that there's a count, that's a continuous count. And then in some sense becomes more important than kings. Kings, by the way, are not mentioned here at all, other than Pharaoh, which is interesting, right? You could have imagined that Israel would have a king, but they don't. And when they have the most important king in Israelite history, which is in chapter 6 of 1 Kings, he does mention, so it's a big deal. He built this temple in Jerusalem. This is Solomon I'm talking about. But the author of Kings goes out of its way to tell you, this is, I think, what, the 60th year of his reign, or something like that, I think it says, right? Where is it?
It's the last page in the,
Right. The last year of his reign, or the 60th year of his reign. But it goes out of its way to tell you that it's the 480th year since the Exodus. It's the only time, by the way, since the end of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy will tell you it's the 40th year, obviously, since that's what the Deuteronomy is. After that, in Judges and Samuel, it doesn't tell you much about the years until it gets into the Kings. But it's a fascinating thing that it tells you it's 480 years, which tells you a lot of political history has passed and is in some sense not important. What's important is like what Sarna is saying here. What's important is this moment in history when Israel became a nation, and it's not a mark of a great dynasty, it's a mark of a popular dynasty, right? Of a nation's beginning. And that is unprecedented in history to have a count. This is what Sarna is saying is maybe the biggest revolution here is to have a calendar that's not the calendar of kings, it's the calendar of people.
Anybody know what other revolution does the same thing in the modern era? Yeah, the French.
Yeah.
They do exactly the same thing. They say the world is literally kind of starting over with us. Of course, they take down these crazy names, Brumaire, Thermidor, et cetera, and they have this, and they reform the week, and they have this sense of the world is literally starting over with this revolution in human consciousness and political institution building. I interrupted you. No.
This is the problem I get going. But
so, what reactions to what Ezra's saying? This is the beginning of a kind of a popular sovereignty concept, I think, is what he is suggesting. This revolution is going to take place not in Cairo and Alexandria and Rome. It's not imperial. It takes place, in effect, in the wilderness. The revelation will be the same in this kind of mountain, basically with kind of no name, no real location. Nobody knows where it is. Doesn't matter. John Levinson talks a lot about that in his work. This is a kind of a revolution in the way people even think about spirituality, both in the political sense, even in the geographic sense, as well as in the chronological sense.
Yeah, if you think about the people that are centered in the story, right? So it's remarkable that it's conscious of an historical transition as it's happening, right? So it could have told you all this also, say, in a later chapter or something like that. It wants you to kind of know that this is, it's being presented as it's happening, and with a very, very conscious about how it's going to be understood in the future, right? And I think the moment that it wants to have us in mind, right, is the renewal of the experience of so somehow you're going to do this forever, right? You're going to return to this ritual of the Paschal Lamb and of the festival of Matzot, and your children are going to ask you about this. And that's what it wants you to be. You're going to hearken back to this moment, this kind of like transition in history, not because it's politically important in some way. It's not about a king. It's about a commoner's kid, right? Who's going to ask a question about it. And obviously we do this, this became the basis for the construction of the Seder that we do to this day. But these questions of a child, this is somehow this ritual harkens back to this calendar and to this transition in history that is somehow meaningful to a commoner's child.
Rick.
Yeah.
But then Shabbat will come. I mean, so Shabbat, not that I think the Shabbat exactly is arbitrary, but it is.
Yeah.
I don't really know when the original seventh day was, so we've chosen one. That seems, I have no objection. I'm happy to be here. I like coming here once a week. It doesn't really matter. So I didn't quite follow how anyone would take advantage of that fact, whether we say that today is Saturday or Thursday or Tuesday. If it's today is Tuesday, Saturday will come. And the other question I had is that if this is all fixed sometime later, about 10th century CE, Sajjageo gets into these debates, and apparently very important, and I'm not an expert in this, conquering intellectually at least Samaritans on the basis of which calendar is which, or Israelites, which calendar are going to follow. They say this day,
Right.
he says that he wins. So, but if the calendar was fixed, well, they're still arguing about it.
Yeah.
Because he wins. And this is a big, my understanding is that this is a big feature in his victory.
Wow, those are great questions. So it's really interesting. So I'm reminding me of a moment that I think is actually a really important moment in, I'm taking more risk here because I'm going to mention in American Jewish history. Since I'm talking next to David. I know that. American Jewish history is certainly accurate to David. But this is something that came out in the research I was doing for my book. There's a moment in 1928, late 28, early 29, in congressional testimony where a version of your question is asked about the week. And that's a time when an alternative to the calendar is being proposed, the international fixed calendar. The person most famous for this calendar is George Eastman, who was the president of Kodak and one of the most prominent Americans of that time in the world, industrialist at the time. He was a kooky guy for all kinds of reasons. But there was a whole movement to shift the calendar so that it would basically retain the Gregorian calendar, so 365 and the leap year and all that, but it would make something that was sort of like the week be subservient to the calendar, right? So one other way you can see that the week and the calendar are not the same system is that they're in tension with each other, right? When you've got, and that shows up actually even within our system, in the Israeli calendar, that they're in tension with each other, and we've got a problem whenever Shabbat falls out on whatever the holiday is, and they try to rejigger it in a way to manage those tensions. But that's a familiar issue that we have in calendars. That was among the reasons why alternative was proposed. The alternative was, there was a bunch of variations on it, but the main alternative was going to be 13 months, in square quotes, by 4 by 7. So you have, sounds very familiar, but every week would have 28 days.
Every month.
Every month, every one of these 13 months would have 28 days. And then the problem they had is that equals only 364. Right? And then that was kind of the crux of the issue. It's like, what do you do with that extra day? But, and by the way, this harkens back to, this is an ancient problem. So the Book of Jubilees, right, promotes a calendar that has that element too. So this issue of like, we usually take for granted, calendar is really important, it turns out, because they generate a tremendous amount of heat. And this issue that the artificiality of the week and the fact that we don't know in some scientific sense when it began cycling came up. And so that was one among the allegations. So there was a whole bunch of, I think an American Jewish hero, a congressman from New York, Leo Bloom, who led the charge. Incredibly, he was like completely unself-conscious by the fact that he was basically defending a Jewish interest. And that was the most clear interest that was articulated, was Jewish. Seventh-day Adventists also objected to this. And the reason was because what would happen is if they did add this extra day, this 7-day cycle, which would be the basis for the work week, would have been out of sync with our Shabbat. And then we would have faced an issue, which is, do we give up on the perpetual week, or do we align ourselves with this calendar that would have been adopted? And so you had a whole series of rabbis from every denomination line up to testify in Congress against it. And then among the arguments against it was, hey, wait a second, the day itself is even arbitrary, because we've got an international date line, which had only been a generation or two since it was in place. and this is all kind of artificial. Can't we just move it? And putting aside, what the right or wrong with what I think. So what's important about it? I mean, it's true for the calendar too, as you're saying. I didn't catch your name.
Rick.
Rick. I think there's a lot of ways you could say why it's significant. I think it's significant that it was so important to people, right? And so in the case of the calendar, the fact that it was important, you can see this in the Talmud, right? Of the importance of being on the same calendar over vast areas of territory, even when a calendar was relatively unimportant because we didn't have political sovereignty. So I'm talking about now during the Second Temple period and then thereafter. The fact that it was always really important for us Jews to be on the same calendar, roughly, and then to have big fights about it as the calendar got fixed, I think said something about what's important to us, to be on the same page, so to speak. And from the standpoint of the week, similarly, I guess I would say, I think it's just meaningful that people thought it was so important to keep, now we're talking about intergenerationally also, to be on the same schedule that earlier generations were on. It's arbitrary, but the fact that we fight cultural wars over things that are otherwise arbitrary, I think tells you what's important to us and it's significant just in that sense.
My somewhat more fuzzy take on this, Rick, is that the classic sort of rabbinic take on this is that it's really about power in the sense that the revolution here is that enslaved people don't control their time.
Right.
By definition, right? The master controls it. They don't have watches. Maybe the foreman does, kind of thing. But it's a master-slave relationship thing. It's driven by that. And in that sense, time is social too. It's not really, it probably hooks back to nature in all the obvious intuitive ways in terms of, sunlight and when you can be productive and when it's, sort of unproductive to try to work. But fundamentally, it's really about the power dynamic. And so the Torah here in 12 is basically saying, we're having this revolution and you're going to concretize that in very tactless ways by saying, you've got to master your own time. This is, of course, what we say to our children too, which is, hey, stop whining that you can't get anything done. Now that you're bar mitzvah, or now that you're 18, part of being a mensch is that you can manage your time. We sort of just intuitively get that. Well, one last sec. Yeah. And of course, if you look at the comments in Eitz Chaim, they preserve some of the rabbinic glosses on this that basically speak to that. It's about creativity. It's about power. And this is sort of where Jewish genius for culture making begins, with this notion that says God is saying, you want to be free? This is what freedom is. It's about being accountable. Being accountable is using your time wisely. And it's true, they then sort of slough off the details, saying, oh yeah, the mathematical piece of actually figuring all this stuff out, by definition, will also become both a scientific mathematical set of problems, but ultimately political too. Rick mentioned the Jews vis-a-vis other communities, but even within the most famous medieval thing that my teacher, Gerson Cohen, taught me was this fabulous conversation between the Palestinian authorities in the Middle Ages and the Babylonian ones, including Sadia, who were battling because they recognized whoever gets to decide what the calendar is really has power. There's a tremendous kind of prestige to that, as well as very practical matters, as well as Ezra's pointing out. So go ahead, Ez.
So I would say that I like that a lot, and I would say the rabbis usually, I think the rabbis were geniuses, and among their geniuses was they read the text very carefully. So I actually think you can see what David just said in the text itself, and it begins in actually chapter 1. And so
you mean of Shemot or
of Exodus?
Yeah.
Right, and so think about what was the define. So another way to summarize, I think, what I was saying is popular sovereignty is a great word that David used, right, and that is reflected in our calendar, and at least anti-monarchical, right, anti kind of power and intergeneration across space and time, right. We are together with fellow Jews in this kind of calendar, and it doesn't matter what political authorities we're in, etc. And you can see that in the first chapter. Where do I see that in the first chapter? Well, what was the defiance of the midwives of Pharaoh? Pharaoh basically said, you essentially have to watch the clock. And the clock is of the women who are going to give birth, and then you're going to commit infanticide. And they said, oops, actually, we don't control the clock, right? The women, and funny they use this, oh, they're like animals. They have, before we get there, they have their children. And then, if you think about the next beginning of chapter 2, what's the defiance then of the Pharaoh? It's vatitzpaneu shlosha yerachim. Somehow, Yocheved, Moses' mother, hides him for 3 months. I think the rabbis are not alone in this, but connecting the lunar cycle with the gestational cycle, with the menstrual cycle, right? There's something going on here, and then there's the famous Chazal, famous rabbi saying that it's in the merit of righteous women that the redemption came. That's focused on this story of the midwives and Moses' mother and sister and the daughter of Pharaoh. But there's a theme here which is about control of time, and the tyrant doesn't get to control the time and therefore of life, right? It's the women who are controlling it. And notice the lunar kind of theme there. I think that arguably is what is being returned to here with the counting of the days of the lunar cycle to begin this revolutionary calendar. You can also see it. There's a build up to it too. That's not the only moment. You can see it in when Moses and Aaron say, "Let my people go." What do they say? 3-day journey into the wilderness. This was pointed out to me by a scholar, Jonathan Burnside, I think. Well, okay, 3 days, that's interesting. 3 days, then they have a holiday, and then they walk 3 days back. Add that up. Yeah, right? And so that's another way to think about the week. And he says in response, Pharaoh, why would you do this, Moses and Aaron? Let the people continue to toil, meaning it's a little bit, Hirsch, I think, says this conspiratorially. Like, what are you talking about? It's a popular festival? This is like religion is basically it's a little like a Wizard of Oz. Like it's supposed to be controlled by we use religion to bamboozle the people, right? It's like the public authorities are the ones who basically use religion as the opiate of the masses or something like that. Like you would give them, and he says vishpatem otam misivlotam. Why would you? He's the first character in the Bible to utter the word Shabbat, right? As the root is Pharaoh, and he's saying it. Don't give them a Sabbath. And then what he does then is makes them work every day in this kind of tyrannical kind of policy. And there's a drumbeat of day after day, day after day, day after day. And the sages again say, you know what happened? Actually, it was Moses' idea to have a day off every 7 days. This is in Exodus Rabbah. And this is where Pharaoh actually abrogated it. Why? Because they would get together and they would basically talk about that the Redeemer was coming. And like all kinds of midrashic backstories like that, I think what's going on is not that they meant that this is actually what happened. It's pointing into the text. The text is basically is emphasizing in a subtle literary way that there's a contest going on over here about who controls time and therefore life.
Right.
Is it the tyrant or is it the people?
Right.
And that Shabbat is kind of expressing that. And then if you look in the beginning of the plagues, you start to build too. There's a whole contest over when is this plague going to happen, right? And even the transition from the second plague, with actually between the first and the second, you see, and it was 7 days past. So very strange that the text goes out of its way to tell you that. And then you have this fascinating dialogue between Moses and Pharaoh. Where Pharaoh says, get rid of these frogs. And Moses says, oh yeah, big guy, okay. When should I do that? When should I get rid of these frogs? It's a very strange question. And it turns out he's onto something. Pharaoh says, tomorrow. Let's see if you can do it by tomorrow. And that's what happens. And you see the word machar, tomorrow, shows up in the plagues, I think 4 or 5 times, I forget. And there's all this whole kind of game going on with predicting. That happens in the 10th plague too, in this week's portion. It's, right, it's basically kachatzot halayla. I'm going to go out at midnight, right? So it's basically who controls time. Well, it's this slave people's deity that controls time, and Moses through them,
right.
Not the tyrant. The tyrant doesn't control time.
Right.
And that's sort of the lead into that, I think.
Miriam, did you have a question or comment? Sure. Other questions? Other questions or comments? Yeah, Jules? Eastern as in, you mean in
Like
Asia?
in Mesopotamia? Oh, Far East? I'm not an expert on Far Eastern calendars. Like I said, I think the default is calendars are, schedules for kings and priests, right? That's what they tend to be. They're like, I think, like I said, the main shift I think in concept you're thinking about the pre-Julian world and the pre-Jewish world, right? Is, we have official things we need to do, contracts, festivities. So the Julian calendar, there's a great book about this by Sacha Stern, is a historian at University College London, is maybe the dean of ancient calendars and certainly the Jewish calendar. Does a lot of really interesting work. And so the Sadia this controversy is like an echo of what happens as the notion of calendar fixing kind of spreads throughout the world, according to Sacha Stern. It's like kind of a last gasp in the Jewish world. And so the notion of having a calendar that was that kings couldn't intervene in was, like I said, a revolutionary idea. Ironically, and maybe only could be brought to the world by the king of the world's greatest power, which is Rome. And then that idea spread throughout the world. In part, they promoted it. Apparently, they promoted even calendar fixing of lunar calendars. And Sacha Stern argues that's how the idea of fixing our calendar came about too, and went as far as the Far East too. So the reason the Chinese calendar ends up being essentially identical to ours, and also is not something that even the Chinese Communist Party didn't think to intervene in, is a result of the spread of ideas about how to fix calendars. And so our calendar is very similar to the Chinese in that respect. Although getting it done and fixing all that, it's not a trivial thing. It led to controversies over the centuries. Yeah. I think for a lot of these things, yes. Though I don't know that leads to really the preference for one calendar or another. I think in the case of, so calendars in general, and then the week became eventually a basis for scheduling markets, among other things. But you can schedule markets in other ways. Like it became just convenient, I think. The Julian calendar, so I would say, one thing you can see very clearly is that in the standardization movements of the 19th century, early 20th century, with industrial capitalism and global trade, you definitely see economic reasons for standardizing time. So that probably a lot of people in the room know that the reason that our time zones got standardized was because of railroads and commerce. They're taking place through railroads. And broadly, that's kind of where you get the, globalization of trade is where you get international dateline from. And then, you're talking about, say, the Japanese trying to catch up in the late 19th century, the Meiji Restoration. They adopt both the Gregorian calendar and the 7-day week, which were unknown. So week was certainly unknown for commercial / industrial / just catching up kind of reasons. But the origins of the calendar, you're talking about, like say in Julius Caesar, you're talking about the ability to manage an empire over time. There was also kind of like, it was an achievement of ancient science to be able to pull this off, and there's a whole bunch of reasons.
It's also interesting because, there are two kind of qualities to this whole marking time thing that are in this Cedra, one of which is the notion of remembrance, story, and that's time-based. Obviously, you have to have some sense of relation to the past, mythic or otherwise. But then, of course, the other note in this is that ultimately you don't, even though most of us would, like if I asked you, how do you learn? What's gonna be stickiest for you, a story or a practice? What are you gonna say? What's sticky for you, practice or story? For a lot, it's really practice. It's routinization of something.
You have to choose?
Well,
They go together.
no, they hopefully they do. They certainly, Judaism kind of thinks they do for sure. But there's a lot of practice in the Cedra, right? In other words, the whole making of the calendar is a part of this idea that says you have rituals, then you got to schedule them. And the clock is a huge part of that. Shabbat is a huge part of that. The week, the Yom Tovim, right? The year, the sacred calendar. If you don't have that, you'll kind of run amok.
can I mention one last thing?
Yeah, and by the way, I would say, speaking of work, this will become. You mentioned George Eastman.
Yeah.
Henry Ford is another one. Frederick Taylor, scientific management, industrial capitalism. They're obsessed with trying to get on top of workers. They've got certain production goals, and that they kind of work backwards from the goals to trying to control time, which was a kind of a revolution. I don't know, did you read those David Montgomery books yet? This was a kind of a revolution in work, because in older cultures, work was much more artisanal, and people had a certain degree of control over how they made stuff, when they made stuff. And of course, scientific management was coming along and saying, no, we want you to be, in the Waltham watch factory from 8 to 5. We want to be controlling how many watches you're making. So the timepiece is huge, pardon the pun, is a huge part of this. And so the calendar, plays into that as well. And I think that also becomes a part of the conversation about trying to preserve Shabbat, politically and spiritually and communally for us as immigrants. And by the way, this is already happening in Europe because they're industrializing in places like Łódź and Manchester. Jews are becoming proletarianized or working in factories. Some of you probably had grandparents who were factory workers. So that has a huge impact on the quality of Jewish life because of Shabbat. So it's very hard to separate kind of the cultural piece of this from the technological piece, from the political piece. That's what makes it such a wonderful subject. And it's clear from chapter 12 that they don't, by definition, they don't have the answers to all that. But there is this recognition that says, if you don't pay attention to time, you're not going to be as free, right? In other words, freedom really depends upon time in some way. And the thing that Rick was sort of getting us to is that time is really, in many ways, social and cultural. It's not just natural. It's not organic. It's not really science. It's people kind of manipulating it. And I think that's what makes it such a wonderful subject. As last comment. And
The last comment I'll say is, I love that last point, and so I guess if the main thing that I take away relevant to chapter 12, and then you see, let's say, Kings, is that the calendar and then the week, can be a strike against tyranny, a strike for the people, and not just our people, but it spreads. I actually think that the transition from industrial capitalism and the attempt to control time, which capitalists kind of need to do, they invest in this big piece of capital and they need to get it as efficient as possible, and that's the pressure, essentially, to get. If you read a lot of historians, labor historians in particular, historians in the 19th century and the 20th century, they'll emphasize how capitalism basically took over time, but they never actually took over the week. And so factories were, for the most part, closed on Sunday,
right.
And we even added a day.
Right. And even, by the way, and even slaveholders, this is a part of the polemic, the pro-slavery polemic, was, we give the slaves off on Sunday too.
Yeah.
Part of that was them trying to Christianize them as a way of controlling them, but also their own sense that says, like, this is what it means to be civilized. You have a Sabbath. If you're a serious Christian, you have a Sabbath, and you can't see yourself as a serious Christian if you're denying slaves that. So that becomes a part of the polemic, the pro-slavery polemic.
I highly recommend David Henkin, who's a historian at University of California, Berkeley, came out with a great book last.
Comment?
Comment for your wife.
For my wife.
The 7-branch menorah is ours.
Oh yeah. Of Mishkan Tefila.
No.
No, just in general.
As in the 7. Yeah.
Yeah.
And David Henkin, grandson of a very distinguished rabbi, Rav Henkin, Ezra Henkin.
So 2 tidbits from about the modern week that Bostonians should know about. One is from this book, which talks about the purity. So one thing that I think Americans maybe not appreciate, I didn't appreciate through the book, is how important the Sunday Sabbath was in American history, say as contrast with the continent. There's a bunch of reasons for this, but like super important the way that David was saying. Very strong commitment to basically not working on Sunday. And one little tidbit for Bostonians is that the
Blue Laws.
What's that?
The Blue Laws.
Sure.
Yeah.
Is that the term Beantown comes from Puritans basically using beans like cholent. And so not cooking on Shabbat and leaving it over sort of reflects the importance they put on Shabbat.
Did they use flanken too, or just
I can't
beans?
comment on that. But the other comment is that the story of
Chazer.
how it is that we add another day to make the modern weekend is a very complicated story, something else I've been research on. But there's a really important Boston part of the story. That's one of the most, things that I think Bostonian Jews should be most proud of, which is Malden Mills. So the first plant in America to give its workers off on Saturday was the Malden Spinning Mills. It was founded by Samuel Feuerstein, who was a young man at that time, an immigrant from Hungary, and I think did, as David was saying, had some experience already with this issue in Europe. He was a frum guy, as they say. He would refuse to work on. He also had a lot of Jewish workers, and if you look even 30 years later, the 2-day weekend wasn't here, but the plants in America that were on a 5-day schedule were disproportionately in the garment industry and disproportionately Jewish. About a third of those plants were Jewish in 1929. But he was the first. And people know the story about the Malden Mills fire with his grandson Aaron, and the great sanctification of God's name that he performed. You can draw maybe an arc back to his insistence on having a day off. So this is now defiance of, the thing I was going to say is, if you read a lot of labor historians, they'll basically tell you, the capitalists took over the calendar, but like there's defiance here. And the family has a story, which is that he closed his shop, the plant was closed on Saturday, and a Sears buyer came by. And in those days, there was no more important buyer, right, in America than Sears. And people told him, this plant is closed, this new plant that maybe he would learn something about and maybe buy from. And he was just flummoxed by it. It's closed on Saturday. When will they open again on Monday? And he was apparently so curious that he came down on Monday and he committed to a big order, and the rest is history.
Okay.
Defying industrial capitalism can maybe lead to.
All right. Yasher Koach, Ezra. Thank you. Yasher Koach.
Talking to you all.
Okay. All right. Let's finish up with Ein Keloheinu.